Today on Business World, what the new tax code means for you. Some have said that the new tax bill amounts to a significant tax break for the very wealthy, a departure from the president's repeated claims that the bill would not benefit the rich. The new tax break goes beyond what was in the original House and Senate bills, with Congress seeking to ensure wealthy earners in states such as New York, Connecticut, and California don't end up paying higher taxes as a result of the bill. As of January 1st, 2018, big business tax rate fell from 35% to just 21%, the largest one-time cut in U.S. history for the nation's largest companies. The House and Senate bills originally had the big business tax rate falling to 20%, but were not able to make the math work and start it right away. So they compromised by moving the rate to 21%. It still amounts to roughly $1 trillion tax cut for businesses over the next decade. Politicians argue this will make the economy surge in the coming years, but most independent economists and Wall Street banks predict only a short-term boom. One of the most controversial parts of the plan is the push to greatly scale back how much state and local taxes Americans can deduct. Under prior law, the state and local deduction was unlimited. In the final plan, people can only deduct up to $10,000. The House initially restricted the $10,000 to property taxes, but the final bill allows any state and local taxes to be deducted, whether for property, income, or sales taxes. The move is widely viewed as a hit to blue states such as New York, Connecticut, and California, and there are concerns it could cause property values to fall and leave less money for public schools and roads. On another note, thanks to a late push by the Senate, the child tax credit would be more generous for low-income families and the working class. Originally, the credit was $1,000 per child. The House and Senate bills expanded the credit, with the Senate going up to $2,000 per child. The final bill keeps the $2,000 credit, but get this, families making up to $400,000 get to take the credit as well. Moving on to healthcare. Beginning in 2019, Americans would no longer be required by law to buy health insurance or pay a penalty if they don't. The individual mandate is part of the Affordable Care Act, and removing it was a top priority for some congressmen. On another note, after much debate, in the end, the estate tax, often called the death tax, would remain part of the U.S. tax code, but fewer families will pay it. Originally, Americans could pass on up to $5.5 million tax-free. That threshold is $11 million for married couples. The House wanted to do away with the estate tax entirely, but some senators felt that was too much of a giveaway to the mega rich. The final compromise was to double the threshold, so now the first $11 million that people pass on won't be taxed. And yes, that means $22 million for married couples. When it comes to industry, most American businesses are organized as pass-through companies, in which the income from the business is passed through to the business owner's individual tax return. S corporations, LLCs, partnerships, and so on are all examples of pass-through businesses. In the final bill, the majority of these companies get to deduct 20% off their income tax, a large reduction that mirrors what was in the Senate bill. Good news for students. The bill keeps in place the student loan deduction, the medical expense deduction, and the graduate student tuition waivers. The House got rid of these popular deductions, but the Senate bill kept them. In the end, they decided it was better to allow millions of middle-class families to continue using these breaks. On another note, 401ks and IRAs stay the same. No changes to the tax-free amounts people are allowed to put into them. And finally, the Johnson Amendment stays in place. The Johnson Amendment, which has been in place since 1954, prevents religious institutions and nonprofits from getting involved in politics. Thank you for watching MDC-TV. There's more to come here on Business World. Welcome back. We're here talking about the new tax policy, and joining us today to explain this tax policy is Miami-Dade College's Professor of International Relations and Political Science, Richard Tapia. Professor, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's good to be back on Business World at Miami-Dade College.
Professor, the new tax cut, it lowers the corporate tax rate, which was 35%, down to 21%. President Trump has received a lot of pushback, and some are saying that this is a tax cut for the rich. Is this a tax cut for the rich?
Well, it's definitely considered to be regressive, and it's regressive because it gives most of the windfall to the top 1% and to corporations. Now, an argument can be made that some of the benefit is going to go to the middle class and to the working poor, but those are only temporary tax cuts. Within the next 2 years, that tax cut for the middle class and the working poor is going to disappear. Oh. In fact, the earned child income tax credit was not expanded, was not included. Family earned income tax credit was not expanded, a provision that even some Republicans wanted to see included in the bill, such as Marco Rubio. But the worry is that that money is not going to go to the middle class or working poor, and that the top 1% that are the owners of these stock companies, because you're right, most of the tax cut went to the corporations to lower the tax rate, the effective tax rate for corporations, from about 35% down to 21%, and most of that's going to go to the top 1 to 5%. Only 5% of the American public is able to basically invest in stocks. So most of that money is going to go to the very top, and that money, despite what the proponents of the tax cut would claim that it's going to circle back into the economy, much of that money is being used to buy back stock within the stock company. So it's allowing for the 1% to get richer and to amass a greater portion of the wealth. 1% of the population today controls close to 40% of the wealth. And with these tax cuts, the critique is that this 1% is going to be able to expand their wealth while the middle class is going to get poorer. It's going to basically dwindle. You're going to have less money circulating down. And in doing so, in the long term, it's going to stagnate the economy, even though in the short term, you may see an economic boom. Now, some would make the argument that it was necessary for America to lower their corporate income tax to 18 to 21% in order to remain competitive with the Europeans and some nations such as Great Britain and so forth. In fact, some proponents of the tax cut feel that the tax cut doesn't go far enough, that they feel that the income tax credit or the income tax of effective income tax of corporations is what I meant to say, right, should be at 18% or even 15% to allow for America to be one of the most competitive corporate tax rates, right, in order to allow businesses to come in. The problem with that is that it creates a major budget deficit within the federal budget. And budget deficits lead to trade deficits because we're going to have to borrow that money to offset from the revenues we're not bringing in with the tax revenues. Because not only did we do a tax cut for corporations, we didn't offset it by raising taxes on the top 1%.
Wow. Okay.
So what eventually is going to happen as we borrow massive amounts of money to pay for these budget deficits is that the value of our currency is going to go up, making our exports more expensive, and that's going to grow our trade deficits, which may lead to unemployment, especially if the economy eventually cycles back into a recession. It may be a double whammy, especially with the tariffs.
Yes, and it's interesting because politicians were actually arguing that this is going to make the economy surge, but most independent economists and Wall Street banks, they're predicting that it's only a like I think you just articulated, a short-term boom, if you will. The child tax credit originally was $1,000, and it was pushed up to $2,000. Is this a way to appease the middle class for the big tax breaks that multinationals received?
Yes, but it was only temporary. And that's why many people feel that the earned income tax credit that was brought in, I know I said earlier,
yes,
they barely got anything. They got it, but it was temporary. It was a very small amount. If you listen to people who wanted, even Republican Senator Marco Rubio wanted a higher earned income tax credit, but it doesn't compare. It tends to be really a small concession to the middle class and the working poor compared to the concession that the top 1%,
absolutely,
the millionaires,
right,
and the billionaires, right, were able to get. This was a complete windfall. I mean, this isn't trickle down, this is trickle up all the way through, where all of the wealth is now gravitating to the top 1%, and there's this fear that you may see a new gilded age, where they talk about a golden age in the stock market, but it's only gold-plated, where all of that wealth is only going to the top 1%, while the rest of the public really find themselves with higher cost of living, flat wages, find themselves trying to cover health care that covers less but is more expensive. housing that is not affordable, and more it seems like it becomes more difficult for the middle class to be able to sustain themselves, while the top 1% become the super rich, especially in a time of the greatest economic expansion in all of human history, where we have more markets, more wealth than ever before, but yet the middle class and the working poor are not seeing it because it's all gravitating to the very top.
Interesting enough, before the prior tax policy, the amount of money you can deduct was unlimited. But in the new tax policy, it's limited to $10,000. So it seems like you're mentioning it, they're restricting more and more. But the question is, many people are saying that they feel helpless though, because after all, what can you actually do what can you do to stop this tax policy? What were they able to do? I mean, regular citizens, right? But corporations have so much influence in politics, and I go back to the symbiotic relationship between politics and the business community, and how they're able to influence politics many times to the detriment of the American people. What can we do that is practical, that is effective, so this type of tax policy doesn't happen? There needs to be a paradigm shift in the way politics is run, because it's like you just articulated, it's so one-sided, and it feels like the voice of the people is not being heard.
Well, what is needed is campaign finance reform. I think that's the obvious answer. And what you're alluding to is the fact that business associations have financed many of the political campaigns of those that have been elected into Congress. And in doing so, as part of climb politics, as part of a payback, a thank you, part of the patronage of these big corporations helping these politicians get elected, they then basically pay back the favor by implementing policies that benefit those interest groups. And is one of the reasons why there's so much critique of the Citizens United case, in which the Supreme Court said individuals have free speech and they don't concede those rights when they join an association, a political action committee, or a corporation. And essentially they said a corporation is a human being, is a person with rights, and therefore could it freely express themselves unlimited in unlimited amounts in campaign finance through electioneering committees or super PACs, which allows for public opinion to be steered in favor of certain politicians that grab massive amounts of campaign contributions from these corporations that in turn will basically implement the policies of these corporations, in many ways to the detriment of the rest of public opinion, to the rest of how the American public feels about that issue. And the tax cuts, by taking money away to the general fund and making the general fund in many ways insolvent, it gets to the point where the politicians have to ask themselves, where do they get the money in order to balance out the general fund? And what you begin to see is that they're beginning to raid Social Security, they're beginning to raid other funds in government to make up for the shortfall in the general fund. And to clarify, so that people could understand where the money for the general fund comes from, the money from the general fund comes from the income tax. The general fund pays for the military, for Medicaid, for, let's say, educational programs, transportation grants, and all other programs, with the exception of two. We're talking about Social Security is funded through the Social Security tax, in which people pay about 6.85%. And then you have Medicare, in which people pay about 1.35% of their paycheck to fund the Medicare fund. These funds are not supposed to be raided unless you get 2/3 of Congress to approve, 60% of Congress, or up to 66% of the Senate to be able to approve it, to be able to raid the Social Security fund. Actually, for Social Security, I believe it's 60%.
And that's not happening now?
It did happen. In fact, what was interesting is while the controversy was taking place in regards to immigration, and the American public was distracted on that issue, on immigration.
Like wedge issues. These are what they
These
call
are wedge issues, right? Meant to divide and really divide the population, to distract the population. So issues such as raiding the Social Security fund can take place.
Okay. Professor, let's pause right here. When we come back, I want to ask you about the military budget. It was recently $700 billion. Is that excessive? Is that telegraphing a certain intention from the government? Friends, thank you for watching MDC-TV. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
college is a great, great college.
It changed my life. Miami-Dade is really like a family. They really embrace the students. They really have a way of making you feel wanted, making you feel loved, making you feel that you could really do what you desire to do.
I am very happy that I came to Miami-Dade College North. Wonderful faculty, wonderful advisors. I feel speechless because they're so good at what they do. I feel that students should not give up. They should become someone. They should be in a major that they love.
And Miami-Dade really, has made a huge impact on my life for the better.
I feel that everyone should do that. Everyone should take that extra step and continue their education. Come here to Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade is great.
Welcome back to MDC-TV. We're talking about the new tax policy, and we left off with the military budget, which was $700 billion. Is this projecting any foreign action, or is this just business as usual?
Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, before he left office, coined the phrase military-industrial complex. And he basically characterizes the nexus between the military and business interests that advocate for increased budgets to be able to not only fund these interests, but they're going to come together to create a perceived threat to continue to perpetuate their interest. And what I believe what you're beginning to see is the same phenomenon you saw with the business associations, with the budget you're seeing it with the military, where you have these business interests that fund the weapons and fund the hardware, that invest in the campaigns, get politicians elected, and as a way of paying back their clients, advocate for expanded military expenditures. It's not surprising that the same interests that fund these campaigns are able to get politicians elected that really look at perceived threats against the United States, which are real threats, but use it as the pretext to continue to expand our budget. To put it in context, America spends more money than all of the other great powers combined. Our nearest rival is China, that spends over $100 billion, but yet we spend close to $700 billion. And that doesn't include the $100 billion we spend in the contingency fund for the wars in Afghanistan and military operations that are still carrying out. That doesn't include the $40 to $60 billion in possible black box defense-related spending, which is classified, but some testimony has been leaked before the Congress to basically say it's about $30 to $40 billion. We're not talking about money that we invest in Homeland Security or the military components of the State Department or let's say of NASA and other portions. So you have a lot more defense-related military spending that in many ways is causing the largest strain on the budget. Many people talk about Social Security and Medicare. What they don't realize is that Social Security and Medicare are solvent. We have at the moment a surplus in Social Security, which is meant to be depleted in the near future, but that could easily be fixed by getting rid of the wage cap. Wage cap essentially says in Social Security we pay the first 6% on the first $118,000. However, if you're making $100 million, essentially your tax rate is zero on Social Security because you only have to pay $7,000 on the first $100 million. So if you're part of the top 1%, you essentially pay zero, but yet if you're the middle class or the working poor, you have to pay 6%. If you were to get rid of the wage cap and just do a flat tax, Social Security will be solvent. If you were to make it progressive, meaning that the top 1% pays more than the working poor, then you're talking about a system that's going to be solvent for future generations. Instead, what you begin to see is an assault on Social Security, an assault on Medicare, as a way of taking away these social programs so that big business associations don't have to pay their share to supplement the employee share of Social Security or Medicare. And that's why you're beginning to see this movement of saying, let's raid Social Security to pay for the general fund after a big hole, a crisis, a tax crisis and a budget crisis has been, well, it's already been created, but now it's been worsened by these tax cuts. And now it's being used as a pretext to go after Social Security and Medicare, which in many ways is misleading. It's very misleading. This crisis has been perpetuated, has been intensified, because essentially we do not want to implement progressive tax reform like we saw under a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. Under Dwight Eisenhower, the top 1% was paying close to 90% of income over the first $1 million to $10 million.
And I think one of the biggest reasons why that's not happening is because that top 1% has such an influential say on matters of policy.
Oh, absolutely. They vote, they get involved in campaigns, they contribute, they lobby, and they advocate.
As you go down the spectrum, the middle class or the poorer people, they don't, and that's probably for a litany of reasons. They're probably too busy working, taking care of the family, and so on and so forth. So
it's very true. When you look at interest groups, it tends to be an upper middle class phenomenon that people that are up in the upper middle income are able to contribute to interest groups, are able to be involved in interest groups. They tend to be educated professionals that understand the issues and get involved. And education is a key component of understanding the issue and getting involved. And I think that's why it's so important to have civics literacy within not only in Miami-Dade College, but at the secondary and the primary level. And I'm happy to say here at Miami-Dade College, we do a fantastic job of not only getting students involved with taking a course with American federal government, which I teach here at the college, but also getting involved with the Institute for Civic Engagement and Democracy. We incorporate service learning so that students that come to our college understands the importance of not just occupying Wall Street, but occupying the voting booth. And beyond occupying a voting booth, they have to understand that if they're concerned about being citizens, if they're truly going to be citizens in a democracy in which the people rule, and being a citizen is very different from being a subject. You're not going to be subjugated under a king. In our system, the citizens are meant to rule. That means that they need to run for office themselves. They need to participate on boards. They need to basically canvass. They
engage.
They must be engaged in the community
you have
at all levels.
Responsibility to do that.
Absolutely, at the local, state, and federal level. And I'm very pleased to say that here at Miami-Dade College, which we consider ourselves to be democracy's college, our students are very much engaged.
Absolutely. And there's hurdles to overcome, right? Because a lot of people may be watching this and say, well, I don't have the self-confidence to do that. I'm not going to go out there and run for office, or I'm not going to go out there and speak on the issues. But there's certain development that you have to do personally, and you can come here to Miami-Dade College, take courses, engage, participate, go to forums, and then develop yourself to be able to do that. You're just not born a leader. You're made into a leader. But do you want to?
What students and our community has to realize that if they don't speak up for themselves, if they don't speak up for the issues that matter to them, they concede it to someone else who will. And someone will speak up.
Somebody will,
and the problem is the people that are speaking up don't represent them. Don't have their best interest at heart.
No,
they have their own
the interest of what
big
we've been
business
speaking
associations that are really in many ways advocating for cuts in social programs, cuts in education. We've seen public education in Florida and throughout the United States under assault. The amount of money that we spend on education per GDP doesn't compare to other countries around the world. Even war-torn countries like Syria spend 4% of their GDP on education. In Florida, it's 2%.
I want to switch directions. In the next 15 years, the U.S. economy is expected to grow 50%, versus China is expected to grow 300%. How? And I don't want to speculate, but how would that be taken by the leaders of the military-industrial complex? I don't want to sound cynical either, but are they going to allow that?
So there's a theory in international relations, the realist school, that would talk about the balance of power theory. And the balance of power theory would say as a major great power tries to overtake another power, there tends to be a conflict, a preventive war to prevent one power from surpassing from the other. And that was true until 1945. 1945 was a game changer at the end of World War II.
How so?
That was the birth of the nuclear age. Nuclear weapons has, in my opinion, changed the game and the landscape. And two nuclear powers will not go to war with one another, or very unlikely. Let me rephrase that. I should never say never, but very unlikely to go to war because the cost is so high that it would take away any benefit. Now, the World Economic Forum talks about the G8 is eventually going to give way to the G20 because the developing countries are quickly catching up to the developed countries, and in some cases, like Singapore, are surpassing the GDP per capita and basically surpassing in certain indicators within the Human Development Index.
Right.
That should not be seen as a negative thing. The rise of China does not mean the decline of America. It means that America rises with China. In fact, I believe Fareed Zakaria in The Rise of the Rest makes a very strong argument that even if China basically surpasses America when it comes to GDP, it does not mean the end of American power. America will continue to represent 25, maybe even 30% of the world's GDP. Instead, it means that the rest of the developing world has been able to elevate themselves out of poverty. It means more consumers. It means more economic development. However, at the same time, it means greater challenges when it comes to labor exploitation and environmental regulations, and especially when it comes to climate change. How do we combat income inequality in this age of great prosperity because of globalization? How do we make sure that the playing field is level?
Okay.
And how do we basically implement technology to incorporate all of these new consumers and producers into the world market without allowing climate change to get out of control?
How do we do some of those things?
Well, there's many things that can be done. There's, I mean, to not...
You can pick
Right,
one,
right.
There's many, right? It's many, right.
There's many ways.
Right.
One way that India is looking into is universal basic income. Now, the question is, how do you implement universal basic income within the free market? And you're seeing a lot of think tanks beginning, both on the conservative side and the liberal side, trying to think of how to incorporate it. So you basically maintain a living standard or a living wage,
Right.
in which becomes the baseline, and then allow for entrepreneurship to allow the individual to work within a globalized economy, to compete in a global economy, to supplement that baseline, but at least guarantee a basic income in which someone's able to have a living wage. That's one way of looking at it that India, China, other countries are looking at. Here in America, we start talking about how do we combat income inequality, and there's three ways. One, you could do a living wage. Two, we could basically invest in tuition-free public college education. Three, we could basically move to Medicare for all to guarantee healthcare costs and education costs for the middle-class families are taken care of. And we could provide affordable housing. So there are ways of combating income inequality.
Fortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for your insight. Friends, thank you for watching MDC-TV. So next time, if you're interested, you can also check us out on YouTube. Thank you.